Hello, 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 hello. This is Helen Thomas and the CDFM study group. We will continue review of CDFM Module 2, Competency 1, which is a defense budget process. So we covered about half of the material the last time, and we're going to wrap up with the rest of the information today and kind of recap some of the things we discussed last week or the last session, depending on if you're watching the video or you're on the live session. So I'm going to kind of briefly go through from the beginning to where we are today, complete today, and then I'll go back again. Module 2, I will repeat, appears to be the most difficult for people to study because there's a lot of information in there. So you have to break the information down into pieces and consistently go over it to make sure you understand the processes involved, the key individuals, and so forth. All right, so let us begin. Welcome again. All right, so we talked about, I'm going to just flip pages and go through. So the defense budget process goes all the way back to the understanding of the mission of the Department of Defense. This is a certified defense financial manager exam. So it's important to know how we get our money. So depending on the mission of the Department of Defense, which is support and defend the Constitution, to provide security, provide safety for our nation and our allies, is they need money to get the job done. And so we're going to look at the various organizations involved in this process, such as Office of Management and Budget, OMB, which works directly for the president as their resource manager or chief financial officer. Then at the DOD level for the budget, you have the USD Comptroller, Under Secretary of Defense for Comptroller. So we know the Department of Defense is a complex environment. So that's why it's important for us to understand the relationships, the hierarchy, who works for whom, and so forth. Based off of the National Security Act of 1947, it established an organization called the National Security Council, the NSC. The National Security Council is that highest group of individuals who sit down, they analyze what's going on in the country, what's going on around us in our neighboring nations and our allies to determine the priority of the country. So the National Security Council is managed by the president. That is the president's forum, the NSC. Once they make a decision on what the priorities are going to be, what everything looks like, the security, the safety of our nation, then they publish what's called a National Security Council document, the National Security Strategy. That's the big op order, since we all are familiar in most instances with operation orders, op order. So the big op order is the NSS, National Security Strategy. And just think about it this way. When you get a big op order to the subordinate organizations, your first instinct is to go in and to see, okay, what's overall going on and what do they want me to do? So likewise, the Department of Defense, the SecDef, goes in. Of course, he doesn't actually go in himself, but his staff goes in to determine what are the defense-related things in this national security strategy. And so based off of that, the DOD level will publish the National Defense Strategy. So some key individuals we learned about at the last session was the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. The chairman, so the Joint Staff, each of the services or military department have a joint staff. So you have Army, Navy, and so forth. So it wasn't until the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986 that it designated one speaker for the joint staff, which is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So hey, Ms. Tina, I'm recapping some of what we studied last week. And so the Goldwater-Nichols Act 1986 created the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff position, so that they speak for the entire group as a joint effort. And we also learned about the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. That's his second in command, or first in command. After him is the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. And we learned that they have several roles. They are the chairman of the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, as well as being the assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, and also a co-chair or vice chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board. Let me make sure my volume's turned. Can you hear me, Ms. Tina?
Loud and clear, ma'am. Thank you.
All right, because one session I kept going, nobody was talking, and I didn't realize my volume was down the whole session. So. All right, and so we learned about the 3 DoD support system. Every mission that the Department of Defense conduct is discussed, is run, is managed in one of these 3 systems. First system, Joint Capabilities Integration and Development Systems, JCITS. The second is PPBE, Plan, Program, Budget Execution, and the third is the Defense Acquisition System. So what happens is once the big op order, the national security strategy comes in, an analysis is done to determine, okay, we know what our defense mission is. The question is, do we have the capability to get that mission done? So an analysis has to be done. So JCIDS is a system where the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff and his council, which is the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, they then have to determine what are the capability gaps? Where are we missing a capability to meet the national defense strategy, to meet the national security strategy? So JCIDS identifies capability gaps. And the second system is PPBE. So part of JCIDS process is the JROC is analyzing the .MLPF, that's an acronym, Doctrine, Organization, Training, Material, Leader Development, Personnel, Facilities. So in the analysis, they're looking at each one of those areas to determine where does the capability gap lie? Where do we have an issue? So if the issue is doctrine, we need to change the doctrine, organizational structures, the manning documents, those will trigger the PPBE process. It's something in their resourcing we need. If it's a material solution, it's going to need a new aircraft, new vehicles, a new system, major system. The major system, a material solution, triggers the acquisition system. So you see all of those 3 systems work together to meet the national defense strategy. So who's in charge of JCIDS? It's the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, has oversight. On the PPBE side, Plan, Program, Budget Execution, you have different DoD representatives for each. So the planning is the responsibility or the oversight of the USD for policy, under Secretary of Defense for policy. Program is the DCAPE, Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation. The budget is USD Comptroller. And the execution side is also the USD Comptroller, but you probably have some more DCAPE in there too, because you want to make sure that all the policies and guidance you put into place that they're following. So you have different individuals following up. Any questions thus far? So I'm just skimming through the page. And I'll put on the chat because I see you type into. Okay. Gotcha. All right. So what we also learn is the operational chain of command of how things work in the country when it comes to defense. It runs from the president, who's a civilian, to the SecDef, who's a civilian, to the combatant commanders. Each area, Northcom, Southcom, Space Command, all of these commands, all military generals in charge of them, but the operational chain of command, the orders come from the president to the SecDef to the combatant commanders. However, don't forget about the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, who is the advisor, the top military advisor. He translates from civilian to military, from the SecDef or the president to the combatant commanders. Your chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff translates that order or that message to those combatant commands. Part of the National Security Council, you need to know the principal members or primary members, which is the president, vice president, secretary of defense, secretary of state, secretary of energy, and the secretary of treasury. So defense, state, energy, treasury, president, and vice president. Your two advisors, chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, and the director of national intelligence. Remember, if you talk about the national military strategy and it says who wrote it, who's the author of it, the author of the national military strategy or who develops it is the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. However, we do not get our policy guidance from the Joint Chiefs of Staff or the chairman. We get all our policy guidance from the Department of Defense or the SecDef, Secretary of Defense. We touched on the Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, the DCAPE, and mentioned that the DCAPE is in charge of the programming phase of PEEB. The DCAPE, Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, is also responsible for updating the Future Year Defense Program, FYDP. That's that DoD database that keeps tracks of all the major force programs operated by the Department of Defense and all the requirements, all the appropriations, the various services that use those appropriations within those major force programs. So think about it. DCAPE is that cost analysis guide. Their job is to keep track of the programs and how much it costs to run that program. Then when we talked about the budget estimate submission, the budgeting phase, you also have the comptroller information system that's introduced there to keep track of the budget request that is submitted. What is the final document at the end of the planning phase of PEEB? That is the Defense Planning Guidance. What is the final document at the end of the POM and the programming phase of PEEB? It used to be, so if you take the 2018 exams, I think it still says Resource Management Decision, RMDs, but the newer books, the 2020 book, it is the Program Decision Memorandum, PDM. So at the end of the programming phase, the final approval document is called the Program Decision Memorandum. At the end of the budgeting phase, at the end of the budgeting phase, you have the Program Budget Decision. Program Budget Decision is that final document. And the final document at the end of the execution phase is actually the appropriation. All right, so when the appropriation is enacted, two things happen. The Treasury issuing the appropriation warrant or Treasury warrant, that's the notification that's the legal part that's tied to the Constitution, Article 1, Section 9. And then on the other side, OMB begins the apportionment process. So apportionment, it begins when Congress appropriates, the agencies fill out an SF-132 and submit within 10 days to request their funding. So like DOD has to fill out an SF-132 within 10 days of enactment to OMB, and OMB has 30 days to issue the apportionment. And then DOD issues allotment to everyone that falls under them. We also discussed the process of the budget. When it leaves the president, no later than the first Monday in February, then it goes to Congress. It goes through 3 congressional phases. The first phase, once the president submits the budget, is the concurrent budget resolution. What that phase involved is the House Appropriation, House Budget Committee, and the Senate Budget Committee. They have to decide what guidelines or restrictions to put on the president's budget. So you need to know which House and which Senate is responsible for that phase. House Budget Committee and Senate Budget Committee. Every one of them have a House and a Senate. Then the second phase is the authorization phase. That first phase, when they're trying to figure out the limitation, that does not go to the president for the president to sign. Let me do this. Stand by. Trying to make sure I can see. We don't end up with just names on there. I'm gonna get this right one day. All right, so the concurrent budget resolution is an internal action in Congress. It does not go to the president for signature. The authorization, which is handled by the House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee, goes to the president again for the president to sign to authorize programs. Even if funding is listed in the authorization and the president signs it, it still does not give us money, does not give us budget authority to spend anything on the approved programs. It's just authorizing programs. Then on the appropriation side, the House Appropriation and the Senate Appropriation Committees is responsible for that process. Process happens on the House side, Senate side, then they come together in a conference committee or the third chamber to resolve differences. Once they resolve their differences, they go back to their floors and one document is published and enrolled, submitted for final approval and signature from the president, because only one document can go to become law. So where we are now for today is picking up on page 2153. So I just kind of wanted to recap some of the major things from last week to get us caught up for today and to refresh your memory. Are there any questions on anything we've discussed? Or maybe you've gone over and you had questions. All right. So page 2153 starts with the DoD appropriation category. So these portions should go by a little bit more faster because it's more of information purposes, but we don't want to miss anything. So some of your appropriations, let me see if they have a chart, and they do. I always like these good charts. Some appropriations that we deal with, the major categories we deal with are MILPERS, that's how you pay your military folks. Operations and maintenance, that's you pay your civilians and your miscellaneous payments go in there. Research, development, test and evaluation. Procurement, that's when you buy your major systems. And military constructions. So what you're going to look at now is what type of category are those appropriations. So the chart on page 54 is a good chart for you to become familiar with, because you will see MILPERS, military, is a 1-year type obligation period. It tells you the description, and I'm not going to read the description because you can do that. But I want to point out that MILPERS and O&M are expense type appropriation, annual, 1-year appropriation, expense type. Then you have your RDT&E, which is a 2-year appropriation, and we're going to go over what that means. Procurement is a 3-year appropriation, but if you have the 2020 book, be sure on the far right under typical obligation period that you don't miss that note about shipbuilding conversion Navy. That's buying a ship. Even though it's a procurement, that's one of those exception to policy. You can't build a ship, I guess, in 3 years. So shipbuilding conversion Navy funds are a 5-year appropriation. So it's a procurement, but it's not a 3-year. It's a 5-year. And military construction is a 5-year appropriation. So what does that mean? Those years are telling you when those funds are available for new contracts, new obligations. MilPERS O&M 1-year expense, RDT&E 2-year procurement 3 years, shipbuilding conversion Navy is a procurement, but it's a 5-year appropriation, and military construction is a 5-year appropriation. What I also want to point out on that same page 54 under O&M in the description, you have additional exception to the policy. If you can use O&M dollars, 2 million or less to conduct minor construction projects, whatever is deemed as a minor construction under $2 million. That's the 2020 study guide. Because the older books have a different dollar amount. I think it used to be 1 million. You can also procure items using O&M dollars if the items is 250,000 or less. You said not more than 250,000. So 250,000 or less. And I think everything else is straightforward. So O&M, yes, you can use O&M to do a construction project, 2 million, minor construction, 2 million or less. All right, so 55 goes into more detail with annual appropriation. That's at 12 months. RDT&E is an incremental funding type. So incremental in that 2-year period. Page 57 says that procurement and military constructions are considered full funding policy. They operate under the full funding. You got to pay all the money. Because once you get that usable end item. Economy. All right, let's see. All right, so page 61, and I think something similar to this was in actually module 3 and possibly 1, appropriation life cycle, but I'll go over it again. You may not see it in this format again if you see it on a test or something like that. Every appropriation has a phase 1, a phase 2, and a phase 3. Phase 1 is current, such as those years I went over, 1, 2, 3, 5. Phase 2, every appropriation is expired for how many years? If anybody wanted to answer. 5 years. Every appropriation stayed expired for an additional 5 years. So if I have RDT&E funds, which is a 2-year, then the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th year, it's in the expired state. The only thing you can do with the appropriations when it enters the expired state is make adjustments, either upward or downward with those fundings. No new contracts. New contracts can only be done in phase 1. Then phase 3, after that 5-year period, the funds enter the expired or the closed state. At the end of the expired state, it enters the closed or canceled state. When those funds are closed or canceled, the funds are released from our accountability back to the Treasury into the miscellaneous receipts account. However, you do have under a closed account, if you get an invoice and the account was closed, then you have that 1% rule where you can use current appropriation for the same type to pay that bill. If it's not a whole lot and you got the funding, you can legally make the payment. However, if I give you an example such as, let's see, if today is 2 November 2020, and I just gave you RDT&E fund, when will these funds be closed? So I'm going to do it as, so today is 2 November 2020. So what fiscal year are we in? So we're in fiscal year 21, correct? Anybody disagree? All right, so fiscal year 21, we have RDT&E funds. RDT&E is a 2-year appropriations. So they are in phase 1, FY 21 and FY 22. Phase 2, they're there for 5 more years. So that's FY 23, 24, 25, 26, and 27. And then they'll be closed FY 28. Does everyone see how I did that for those that are online or have anything different and want me to clarify? So let me make sure I did that correctly. If it's 2 November 2020, that means we are in fiscal year 21. You need to know that first. I see a thumbs up. All right, thank you. If I have RDT&E funds, and RDT&E funds are good for 2 years, phase 1, FY 21 and 22, phase 2, FY 23 to 27, and that means if the question is when would these funds be closed, these funds will be closed in FY 28. That is probably the way you will see it again on the appropriation life cycle. Your knowledge of the appropriations, your knowledge of their phase 1 current appropriation timeline will then determine, and fiscal year starting 1 October to 30 September, those 3 basic knowledge will help you to answer whether it's current, expired, or closed. Obligating documents, before we can obligate any contract, we got to have the proper supporting documents. So that's what's being mentioned on page 2163. Your contracts, regular SBS contracts, or your MIPers. And let me see if, yep, next page. And under your MIPers, which I didn't really pay attention to the different types of MIPers until I really got into the study guide, the CDFM, understanding that mission can be direct citation or reimbursable. I just figure, oh, we got a MIPer. So if you go to page 64, I promise you, at least one of you is going to tell me after you take your test, oh, I had a question on project order versus Economy Act order, because it's always there. What you need to know are the differences. Think of a project order. If you're doing a project, most likely you need to finish the whole project to get a usable end product. I am repairing a building. I'm repairing a parking lot. I'm painting something. I need to do the whole job. So for a project order, you typically do not deobligate the funds at the end of the fiscal year. So project orders are used for services from another DoD entity versus an Economy Act order, intra-government order that does not qualify as a project order. So once you go with an Economy Act, you're outside of, you can go outside of the DoD. That's what I got of it. It's any other government agency. The second bullet on each one of those on page 2164, when accepted in writing by performing activity, the amount is recorded as an obligation. Because a project, you could consider it a non-severable service, right? A project, because you got to get the job done. So you obligate as an obligation when accepted. An order that will produce a useful service or item by the end of the fiscal year, that's one. Unexecuted portion of the order must be deobligated. So I'm talking about the Economy Act. Deobligation of the funds. On a project, I do not deobligate the funds at the end of the fiscal year versus an economy, right? And project orders are covered under Title 41, whereas Economy Act is covered under Title 31. So make sure you know the differences between a project order and Economy Act order when it's cited on the MIPR. We talk about termination of contracts on page 2166. Is either for contracted default or convenience of the government. And I'm not saying I've seen all contracts, but 99% of the time in the government contracts or the DoD contracts, the KO always writes that they can sever the ties with that vendor if the government no longer needs the service. Contracted defaults, what you're going to find there is if, as the COR, contracting officer representative, if you determine that this individual is not fulfilling their duties according to the contract, you have to contact the contracting officer responsible for it. And then together you may determine you have to fire that contractor. However, if we've accepted any portion of their work to that point, they must be paid. And the KO will determine how much. Because of contracted default, you may still have the requirement. And so that requirement could be fulfilled using that same approval document. But if you start deviating from the approved scope of work, going somewhere else, you want to try something different, then you have to cancel that requirement, or that request, I should say, approval. Any question for me thus far? All right. On page 2170, the working capital fund. We touched on this in module 3 also. So make sure you also, when I say that the information is in other section, that means you also need to review those sections in the different modules. Because again, when you put the information together, you get a better picture. But I think module 2 gives you more information on the working capital good concept. So the working capital fund is that no year that X fund that does not expire. However, they still have restrictions that they have to follow. Working capital fund example is your commissary. That's the one I always use because most people are familiar with the commissary. The commissary, initially when they started, they probably got appropriated funds to set up. Then they had a purpose and customers that they were going to service. So based on what it costs them to get the item on the shelf, then they charge a certain price. Sounds exactly the same as a civilian side. The difference between a working capital fund and the commercial side is the working capital fund's goal is to break even, whereas on the commercial side is to make a profit. So on the working capital fund, each year they have to look at whether they earned a profit or loss or they were on target to determine what prices they're going to charge the customer the following fiscal year. And they have to adjust. So the cost and the prices have to fluctuate so it does not appear that it's a consistent rise and they're earning a profit in the working capital fund. So at the top of page 71 in bold, it mentions the DoD expanded use of business-like, commercial-like practices, established the Defense Business Operations Fund, building on revolving fund principles are linked together, and the fund managers are expected to operate with cost goals established in the operating and capital budget. So what it does is trying to mimic the commercial side, but again, the goal is to break even. So there are two types of working capital fund in the middle of page 71, stock funds and industrial funds. So stock funds, it says determine you're trying to buy material in large volumes from the commercial side and you're holding them in your stock inventory. Industrial funds, that's your depot maintenance, transportation, RDT&E, your research and development type of funding that's used. So both of those types of funds were financed primarily by reimbursement from customers' appropriated funds. Let's see what it says. Another difference between the supply management and the industrial side. So stock fund is your supply side and your non-supply is the industrial. The working capital fund is the type of assets determined on the type of asset it holds. For supply management, let me write that. The major asset is inventory held for resale. That's the food on the shelf. While the non-supply management, the major asset is work in progress. So that's two things there that you need to know. Work that is partially done for customers, but not yet delivered. On page 72 at the bottom, you see it in bold, the goal of the Defense Working Capital Fund is to break even because they're a not-for-profit organization. And basically what I went over with adjusting the prices is listed starting on page 72. They're trying to stabilize their rates in page 72, that last paragraph, a significant challenge that the Working Capital Fund organizations face is trying to stabilize billing rates for the whole fiscal year. So sometimes, yeah, they lose in a sense that it costs them more to put the items on the shelf. So they have to predict costs of the resources to produce in advance of a fiscal year. So it almost, if I read that correctly, it's saying that the cost is projected for the next fiscal year, for the whole fiscal year. So the cost does not change in between or in mid fiscal year. Some profit, some loss. Let's see, net operating. So the profit on top of page 73, got the first paragraph. So the profit or loss in a working capital fund is called the net operating result. And the running total of net operating results for over the fiscal years of the fund's existence is the accumulated operating results. So where we would say your trend. Okay, I don't see anything else there. Funds management, everything else straightforward. Can we accept refunds? Can we keep money in-house? If, let's say you buy something with your government purchase card and they give you a rebate or they give you money back, can you keep it? In most instances, the answer is no. All right, so where does refunds get deposited? Page 2175, refunds and rebate. Generally, I'm reading the first bullet. Refunds are credited to the same appropriation account of the original obligation. However, if that appropriation is no longer available, the funds are credited to the catch-all miscellaneous receipts in the U.S. Treasury. DOD has a statutory exception to the following table relating to refunds and rebates received from banks. Rebates received by the DOD after the funds have expired may be credited to O&M. So again, anything we do with funds that we did not receive through an appropriation, if it's a refund or a rebate, they have to be approval or authority in place for us to expend the funds accordingly. Another question is what happens to the funds once the funds enter the cancel state on the top of page 77. And if you read through all of that, the last sentence of the second paragraph, it actually even gives you the account, the miscellaneous receipt account, which is called collections of receivables from canceled accounts. So they even have miscellaneous receipt account label for that particular account. So let's see, flow of funds. So I'm going back to page 76, flow of funds. We already went over appropriation to apportionment to outlay. Outlay, again, is the same thing as disbursement, but the politically correct response in the CDFM is outlay, when the funds are removed from the treasury to pay that bill. Same thing as disbursement, but be familiar with outlay. Upward, downward adjustments when the expired account, upward adjustments of expired authority, and cancel. The control of funds. Also on page 78, and I think this was also in number 1, module 1, if I'm not mistaken, we looked at the terms unapportioned appropriation, unallotted, unobligated, unpaid, paid, and expired. If you see this again, it'll probably be in kind of like a practical exercise. Because if you know the flow of funds is appropriation first, then apportionment, then allotment, then commit, obligate, outlay, where we actually pay for the bill, then you will know if they say unapportioned, it will tell you that funds have already been appropriated, but it has not been apportioned. So you have to know the flow of funds to be able to do page 78. And let me see if I can quickly, I want to say it was number 1. Let me see. Any question while I'm trying to find this particular response for you? I know it's in another module because I remember seeing, and I didn't write the page down. Let's see, might have been 3 then. Why y'all so quiet? Y'all can't hear me? Lady. And yeah, Miss Tina, Miss Henderson.
Miss Helen, I'm listening in. I'm working on another project.
You're doing something else? Okay.
Yes, but I'm listening in. I mean, periodically I'm turning around and looking at my book and writing notes down. Yes, I'm all good. I'm all good. Thank you.
Okay. I want to make sure, yeah, you guys are actually, since you have an opportunity to, it's different when you go back and listen to the video. You can't ask questions then, but you can always reach back out to me or put a comment out there, and I promise I'll get back with you. All right.
Yes,
so
thank you.
To repeat, on the bottom of page 78, even though you're only seeing terms and definition, this is based off of your knowledge of the flow of funds. So if they give you dollar amounts and they say the appropriation amount is this, the apportionment is this amount, allotment is this amount, and of course they're going to have it jumbled because they're not going to put it in order for you. And then they say, okay, what is the unpaid obligation? Okay, well, you got to know what's already obligated to minus to find out what's not been obligated, unpaid. So I just wanted to put that out. All right, page 2179 goes into MWR funds, morale, welfare, and recreation. So there are 3 categories of MWR funds. There's some that are funded with appropriated money and some that are donated or not donated, where people pay a fee and then they use those fees to then give you more service. So let's look a little bit closer. Morale, welfare, and recreation category A are for mission sustaining programs. And if you look at the chart on page 79, it gives you a visual. They get 100% appropriated funds, 0% NAF funds, non-appropriated funds. That's where you charge people to go to the bowling alley. You charge them to go hunting. That's not NAF funds that they're authorized to use. Category B, and again, I'm still on the chart, 65% appropriated, 35% NAF funds. Category C, no appropriated funds and NAF funds. So it depends on the type of activity. So let's see. So they give you some examples on bottom of page 79 for category A. So like your physical fitness facilities, so the libraries on the installation, your gyms on the installation, 100% appropriated. Category B on page 80, community support programs. So they give you examples. These programs closely related in military mission. Let's see. In the middle there, you see some examples are the automotive skill development, youth centers, youth activity centers, child development, arts, outdoor recreation. That's your category B. 65% appropriated, 35% NAF, where they charge a fee. Then category C is all NAF, non-appropriated funds. Some examples, the bowling alley, boating, hunting, golf courses on these installations are all category C. So that's why they charge you a fee to use those facilities. Okay, so page 81, the exercise there is actually what I was alluding to with the bottom of 78. If you see the information on page 78 again, it's probably going to be in the format that's on page 81. And you're not going to have the formula to the left. They're just going to give you, okay, what's the unapportioned amount? What's the paid amount? What's the unobligated allotment? And so forth. So make sure you do exercise 2.1.1 on page 81. While I'm here, let me look through. On page 82 is a good one if you want to practice later and then get back with me for the answers, where it forces you to think about the PPBE process, the timelines, understanding that things are always continuously overlapping. They give you a date, then you got to say what fiscal year you're in, when is the POM prepared, and so forth. So these kind of get you to think about the process. Okay, that's it for that. All right, so the reason I broke down this section into two sessions is because, again, it's a lot of information. So at this point, I have completed CDFM module 2.1, which is the defense budget process. And I'm going to open up the floor for any particular questions, concerns, or clarification needed on anything that we've discussed, either last week's sessions or today's session, so that we could clarify it before we move forward. Because next week and the week after is also going to be broken down into two sessions, because the cost and economic analysis is another big chunk of information. So I kind of break it down into two sessions. So you need to know this part, module 2.1, back and front, understanding this before I move on next week. So if you don't have questions now and you listen to the video later, you have notes, feel free to reach out to me. Feel free to write once I upload it to YouTube, write a comment asking a question, and I promise I will get back with you. If I don't know the answer, I will find the correct answer for you. All right, I'm opening up a couple of seconds for questions. If no question, that's all I have for today. All right, I don't hear any burning questions. All right, thank you so much for stopping by. This is Helen Thomas and the CDFM Study Group. Please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube page if you have not done so already. Doesn't cost you anything. What it does is the more action, the more buttons you click on that YouTube page, it provides more visibility so that people, anybody types in Google and type in CDFM study material, then those YouTube videos will come up. So your support will be greatly appreciated. Thank you. This is Helen Thomas and the CDFM Study Group. I'll see you guys again next time.